The Blast from Our Past Network.
Hey everyone, co-host Corey here. I just wanted to take a quick second and say thank you to all of our Patreon supporters. Without you, Podcasting After Dark would not be possible. If you would like to help the show grow, please consider signing up at patreon.com/podcastingafterdark. You can also support the show by purchasing one of our awesome t-shirt designs on our merch store at podcastingafterdark.com, or by picking up a copy of 7 Winters Alone by David Irons on paperback, hardback, or Kindle. Just search for 7 Winters Alone on Amazon or click on the link in the show notes. A free way to help out is to leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Those reviews are huge for us and really helps get the show in front of new listeners. Again, thank you all so much for the love and support you've given us over these past few years. It really means the world to us.
Welcome to our Patreon exclusive interview series for Podcasting After Dark with your hosts, Corey Stevenson and Zach Schaefer. Tonight's interview is with the composer of Re-Animator, From Beyond, Prison, and Puppet Master, Richard Band. Richard Band, thank you so much for being on Podcasting After Dark.
My pleasure to meet all of you guys, and it'll be fun. I actually reviewed a couple of your podcasts when you guys set this up, and it sounds like a fun show. It's very good.
Thank you very much.
Did you have? Yeah. Thank you. That means a lot. It really does. To say that your music has been the soundtrack of our childhood, our teenage years, our 20s, 30s, and now 40s is an understatement. You and obviously we had TerrorVision and Prison on our show. We reviewed both of those episodes or movies.
Right.
And it's really an honor to have you on after all these years of providing us with such great music.
Well, it's my pleasure, and I can only apologize for you guys and growing up having to watch those movies. I'm kidding you.
Well, you can talk to our parents about that.
There you go. There you go. My apologies are extended to your parents then.
Well, I might say, and I think Corey would concur, if it wasn't for these movies in our lives, we wouldn't be where we are artistically now, because it's definitely had a huge influence, I think, overall.
Yeah, and not just like this podcast, but like in our lives as a whole, as creatives, as artists, because we would follow these movies obviously behind the scenes too, and through Fangoria magazine, we got to learn how the movie making process worked and everything, and all the documentaries. So, but I mean,
Sure.
you've been such a huge, a massive puzzle piece, like portion of our childhoods, that it's just like Zach said, this is just a true honor.
Well, that's you guys are much too kind. Thank you.
Well, I was going to say too, offline, you were saying that you're in LA. Have you always been in LA?
No. Well, I mean, professionally, yes, but I didn't grow up here. I grew up in Italy, in Rome, Italy.
Oh, wow.
I came back to this country when I was about 17 and a half years old, but my entire childhood was spent in Europe. Left here when I guess I was about 5 years old, 4 or 5. My father was in the business. He was a producer, director, and writer, and he was doing a lot of films and things. Actually, his for years his big connection. He worked with John Huston, and my father wrote the screenplay for The Red Badge of Courage, and worked with Huston on several films. But when it came up to the point where Houston wanted my father to go with him to shoot the African Queen in Africa. That's where they parted company, because my father just felt, well, he had a young family at the time, and he felt, knowing Houston for years at that point as his assistant and then writing for him and editing and all this stuff, he knew that Houston was an avid big game hunter, and he also
Yeah.
knew that he wanted to very much go to Africa to go on safari. So he had sort of this
Mm.
premonition, the way it was told to me, that had he gone uh, to Africa with Houston, that it would have been a disaster, because it'd probably take him a year to shoot the film rather than the 3 months that was allotted. And as it turned out, my father was right, because it took well over a year. Everybody got sick, several people died, and Houston was off 90% of the time hunting. So in retrospect,
Wow.
in retrospect, maybe it was a good idea that he didn't go, or maybe it was a bad idea. Maybe his career, my father's career, would have, gone in a different or bigger direction. But instead, we uh, we went as a family. My father took us to Sweden, and like I said, I was about 5 years old, so that would have made it like 1958, something like that, and took us to Sweden to shoot a film that my father was producing and directing called Face of Fire at the time.
Mm.
And so that's how we ended up in Europe. And rather than coming back to the United States, we then, after that, moved to Paris for about a year. And during that year is when Rome, Italy started exploding and eventually became the Hollywood of, the Hollywood of Europe, basically. So
Yeah.
about 1959 or 60, we moved to from Paris to Rome, and of course all the 1960s is when Rome just exploded with incredible filmmaking, with obviously all the spaghetti westerns and all the Hercules movies, as well as the Italian movies. So we spent the next almost 11 years in Rome, which is where I grew up. And my
Wow.
father was
That
making
that
all
is
those and my father was making all those films, all
yeah,
those
yeah.
westerns and Hercules movies and things like that. So it was a very interesting upbringing, to say the least.
It sounds like almost
I was
like
gonna say that.
a military style, like military kid upbringing. My brother-in-law is in the military, and my nephews grew up all over the world. It almost seems like it's kind of like that sort of scenario.
Not dissimilar. A lot of friends that I had growing up there were military kids. They'd come in with their fathers, for usually like a 2 year stint, what's almost an average, sometimes longer. But yeah, a lot of military families. But also, you have to keep in mind that at that time in Rome, there was a huge uh, expatriate community of American artists there. Lots of artists, of course. I mean, Clint Eastwood, um, the Lancasters, Burt Lancaster, his family. I mean, many, many, many. Gore Vidal, the
Hmm.
writer Gore Vidal, Arthur Morton. I mean, a lot of very famous artists, cinema people, and so forth. So it was a great community, a great time to grow up there. Um, so I was very lucky in that way.
I was gonna say too, that's quite a journey for someone who was only 5 at the time to kind of be bopping all over the place, and then land in Rome with your dad and your family, obviously. But then, yeah, your father, like you said, was making many pictures at that time. And then how did you get involved with the music aspect of film?
Well, the music aspect for film didn't come till many years later. At an early age, though, what happened was my father was making a film uh, uh, in Spain. It was shooting this film in Spain, an American-Italian co-production. which they all were at that point. And so we
Yeah.
went to Spain. This is when I was about 10 and a half or 11 years old. And it happened to have been shooting during the summer, so I wasn't in school. So my father, if that was the scenario, which was quite often, we would go to different countries, not just shooting in Italy, but Yugoslavia, Slovenia, Spain, wherever it was in Europe. In this case, it was Spain, and so we went over there, and I'll never forget it because it was a life-changing time for me. Is the first night that we were in Madrid, he took us, the family, out for a dinner. Uh, in fact, the restaurant is, I can remember to this day, was called El Chotis, a fantastic restaurant in this gorgeous square. And after the dinner, he took us to a flamenco show across the square. And it was at that flamenco show that for the first time I heard flamenco guitar being played. And I just fell in love with the guitar. And it was the next day that I went out and bought myself a guitar and taught myself how to play. That's what started the whole music
Wow.
thing. Not for film, mind you. I just fell in love with
Yeah.
guitar, and it wouldn't be a year and a half or two later that I was forming my own bands and playing around Europe, or around Italy,
Nice.
around Rome at that time. Later it would be around Europe, years later.
Do you remember the name of your first
So
band that you put together?
I have no idea. I remember the last couple of bands. That's what I remember. But yeah, I mean, I actually started performing when I was about 12 and a half or something like that, which was kind of interesting because I was underage and had to get certain permissions to perform in nightclubs. So it was, and I was playing with mostly an adult group. My co-members were not kids; they were adults. So it was unique. Let's put it that way.
Sounds like fun though.
I'm sure they looked at you like, yeah, it sounds like fun.
I think most people
did
were
you
looking at like we were a freak show or something. They said, "Well, what is this kid doing up on stage?"
Well,
But that
nowadays
kid's got some
it's
talent.
commonplace.
Right,
Right. Yeah, I was gonna say nowadays, like with shows like America's Got Talent or American Idol, that's kind of normal to see a young kind of child protege, playing in a band or a musician at such an early age.
Totally different back then. Totally.
Yes.
You're talking like 1963 or four. No, a little bit different then.
Right. Well, so I was gonna say too that on obviously Peter Hackman is a mutual friend of ours, and
Uh-huh.
he represents Vince DiCola, and we had Vince DiCola on my other podcast, and he talked about how when he kind of came out to LA to be to work, he had wanted to be a session musician. So did you originally, and almost like in the band Toto, um, did you originally want to be like a working musician, or and kind of fall into film, or how did that come about?
No. I the last, say, 3 years that I was living in Italy, I had my own bands, like I said, and we were doing it really quite well. We were touring around definitely all of Italy, but also parts of Europe, playing big venues. I was making very good money at the time, especially back in the '60s, and I had no interest in film music per se. I just wanted to be like a rock star sort of thing. I was a young
Yeah.
kid, a rock and roller. Although a lot of the music we were playing and writing back then was sort of more progressive rock jazz type stuff. Uh,
Hmm.
so it wasn't until quite a few years later, back in Los Angeles, that I started getting into film music. But at that point, um, it was all just I was a rock and roller. That's basically all it was. Although an interesting story and timely is, and I wrote this the day that Ennio Morricone died, just several days ago, because in a couple of my father's films, he actually did the scoring for. And when I was about 13 or
Yeah.
14 years old, I remember going to a scoring session at this particular stage in Rome where they were recording the score for one of my father's westerns. And again, keep in mind, I was a rock and roller kid. I had, no real idea about film scoring or anything back then. I always loved films. I always loved all that, but I didn't know much. Anyway, so I go into this scoring session, and I remember being just blown away for the first time witnessing a scoring session with like a 60-piece orchestra. And I was
Wow.
introduced to these three gentlemen who were the writing team. And I would subsequently learn afterwards that the main guy was, in fact, Ennio Morricone. And
Wow.
to this day, I'm always remembering that, because when I did get my very first scoring job with an orchestra, which I can get into if you want a little bit later, um,
Of
I
course, yeah.
remember I was on an airplane on my way to London to record the score in London. This was my very first orchestral score, and like a lightning bolt, uh, that scoring session that I had witnessed just like hit me in the head. I'm going, oh my God, this is like, here it was like 14 years later. I was about 28, 29 or whatever, something like that. And I realized at that point that that was, like a kismet, premonition type of weird thing about how influencing it actually was back then. And it just didn't
Totally.
sort of come to happen until 14, 15 years later. But that was my introduction to Ennio Morricone and film scoring.
Wow.
Well,
Pretty
if you're
pretty
going to be
crazy.
introduced into
Yeah.
if you're going to be introduced into that genre of music, that's probably the top of the list as to who might influence you. So,
Yeah, as it turned out to be, it actually really was, because to sort of jump back and then ahead, as to where
yeah.
your original questions came from, which is how did I get into the film scoring and all that. So I come back to this country in '71, and again, I was coming from an environment where my band back in Italy was doing well, and so I just sort of, you know, dropped everything because we had to come back to this country for a variety of reasons. And so when I came back here, I just thought I could pick up and form another band and be a rock star. But
Yeah.
after a couple of years and realizing that about every third person walking down the street had the same dream, I said to myself, you know what, this is sort of crazy. I had a big advantage in Italy being an American and having an American band and touring around. That was one thing to be in Italy, but to be back in the United States with every third person, in the early '70s wanting to do the same thing, I realized this is like a pipe dream. And it was at that point that I said, well, if I want to be in music, I have to start studying formally. And then I went and started studying formally at at a um, at a college, which was at the time Immaculate Heart College, and then studied privately through several composers for a couple of years during and after that. But it wasn't until years later, till 1978, that I realized that, you know what, I mean, I love movies and I love music and all that. And, but I had to sort of make a decision. What the hell am I going to do with all this? And that's when I got my first score, which was a film that I did with uh, Jerry Goldsmith's son, Joel Goldsmith. We co wrote it. That was our first score. And that was called Laser Blast, a crazy cult
Yeah.
film of the time that you might be familiar with. And
Yeah.
Oh,
started
absolutely.
that's what started the whole journey for the last that's gone on the last 42 years or so.
This could all be happening right now, somewhere on this planet. It's the story of a UFO that has landed and visitors from a galaxy light years away. It's an adventure unlike anything on this planet. A weapon that might belong to us in the future, but is here now. Laser Blast. It's the story of the boy who found it and the girl who tried to help him.
about the lump on your chest.
And a world that tried to take it away.
They didn't know I knew it.
I want the town sealed off. Just no news leaks. No news, period.
Laser blast. It will blow your mind.
That's how it all started. But it was the score right after Laser Blast that came up, which was for a film eventually called The Day Time Ended, that I went, and that was the one where I was on a plane off to London that I recorded in London with a small symphony. It wasn't a full symphony, it was like 40 odd pieces. And so that's where I had that moment where I realized the importance of the Ennio Morricone experience 14 years prior to that.
You want to play?
Yeah, it's great to hear as a creative, because you sometimes you're always trying to like do the next thing, or you're maybe you don't feel like you're making enough traction in your field that you want, but you don't realize that you have some building blocks that you're going to be able to utilize later. So I mean, that as another creative, and a lot of our people we listen to are creatives, that it's great to hear stuff like that.
It's weird. It's weird. But that's life. You run into interesting scenarios, and you come across certain people who are very influential. A lot of times in ways that you don't realize at the time at all. It could hit you a decade later, or a year later, or a week later, or sometimes they're on the spot. You just don't know.
Yeah. You just got to put yourself in those positions.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, another short story, because it's I won't belabor it, but while living in Italy, and I was, I guess, at the time, maybe 11 or 12 years old, the famous studio in Italy, in Rome, was called Cinecittà. That's where they shot almost all the movies, a huge movie studio. And they were shooting this movie at one time called Candy, based on a kind of risque book for the Times many years ago. Anyway, so there was this guy who had a small cameo part in it, and my father, since he had so many ends at the studio and people and all that, he arranged for my brother to go meet this guy, and this guy was a fellow named Ringo Starr. And so we're you heard of that guy, right? A drummer for some band, right?
Some small band.
Yeah, something.
Exactly. And so we went to the studio, and we were introduced to him. And this is another one of those weird things where he greeted my brother and I like we were his long lost cousins or something, and took us into his dressing room, put on a Beatle record, and sat with us for like 30 minutes during shooting, and just talked with us. And to this day, he was probably the nicest and most assuming person I've ever met in my life. So, you don't know,
so cool.
You don't know who you're going to meet and when and how they're going to influence you. But it was the first time in my life that I realized that somebody who was, part of the friggin' Beatles would have the time and be so magnanimous and nice. And if you were a big mucky star, you didn't have to be an asshole. You can be a nice person
No.
and a real person. And because I had grown up around actors and stars and knew many, 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 many of them through my father's work. And, you know, a lot of them were nice. A bunch of them were buttheads. But when I was meeting Ringo fucking Starr, and this guy was like, he
Yeah.
was like my
Yes.
brother or something. You know, it was amazing.
Well, I think you know, it's funny you say that, because I've had a few, and Corey has too, had a few moments where we've met certain people that we admire on a level, and sometimes it's more than just casual. It's a little more personal, and it is nice when you can meet someone that you admire or you look up to, and they end up being a legitly cool person. You know, it's not like just blowing you off like a jerk off. So yeah,
Exactly.
that's
Yeah, no,
great. But
it's an important lesson to know that everybody, they put on their pants one leg at a time like everybody else. It's just an
yes,
important lesson to know in
yes,
life.
exactly. And side note too, you don't have to edit yourself whatsoever on our podcast. You can say whatever you want because it's
Okay,
all good.
okay,
just,
okay,
just so you know.
okay.
But yeah, you know.
I
So
hear you.
so I was gonna go back too for a second. That you know, you said the day time ended was when you were in charge of an orchestra, a small orchestra,
Yeah.
and to go from that's got to be a daunting experience, right? To be in charge of a group like that.
Well, I was, since we don't have to edit this, I was scared shitless. I mean, this was my first time with an orchestra. You know, I mean, I had no idea. Uh, well, I had an idea, but you know, so your first time doing a
Yeah.
score with an orchestra, it's very daunting. But I'll tell you, after the first playback, you know, hearing the music you've written and hear it come out with a orchestra and having it sound the way you had intended or better in some cases, it was definitely one of the two or three most unbelievable experiences of my life. You know, it's an incredible feeling to have that actually happen
I
and come
bet.
off. But on the plane ride there, I was scared shitless. You know, I was scared. That's all there is to it. You just don't, you know, a
Yeah.
first time with something like that and a lot of responsibility and all that. So yeah, it was daunting.
When you're writing
Well,
something
you pulled
for
it
a
off.
symphony with multiple, you know, people like that, does it come like and I know you were happy with how it turned out, but did it turn out how you thought it would in your head, or does it come out like, I know like you write something for a guitar, you can play it and you're like, okay, I know how that sounds, but when you write something that involves 40 people to play it, you don't really know how it's going to sound until you actually do it. Does it sound the way you think it's going to sound, or is it different?
Well, Well, it's always a little bit different, but that's experience. You know, now at that time I didn't have the experience of hearing, you know, an orchestra play back my stuff. I had smaller groups play stuff back. You know, of course, I had the bands. I had, you know, but my experience was very limited at that point. So the first time you hear that back, the reason it was so powerful and elating is because it did sound the way I had envisioned it in my mind's eye or mind's ear. It was
Hmm.
there. Parts were a little better. Other parts were not quite what I meant, but you know, I would say it was 75, 80% exactly what I was envisioning in my mind's ear or eye
That's cool. That's
Yeah.
or
super
ear
cool.
and
Yeah.
eye, whichever.
Yeah, and I asked because, you know, I grew up with more of a fine arts background, and so I have as an artist or a creative, I have no experience of like having other people perform or you know, interact with my artwork. So it's a very like solitary thing, and I just find that, you know, very fascinating, that you can write something to have, you know, all these people create a sound that you created essentially.
Well, again, as I started writing more and more and more, you know, you learn by experience and by trade, how to orchestrate, arrange, and all these sorts of technical parts and creative parts. So you have a sound in mind, and it's kind of how can I say this? It's the more experience you have, the more you're reassured that what you're hearing and your brain is going to come off very, very close to what you're imagining. So that's kind of a normal thing, but it's it's um, it's always something new. It's always with each score, it's always something new, and otherwise, it wouldn't be different than being a carpenter and building the same table over and over and over.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
everything's different. Every situation's different.
Well, you have a very distinct sound. It's become a distinct sound, I believe, in the '80s, specifically, where you really honed in on just an energy that elevates the films you've scored, in my opinion. And you obviously worked, the bulk of your work has been like with Full Moon, obviously, and I'm still trying to. By the way, I still have my Full Moon membership card that I need to show your brother. So
Okay.
I did at one point. I was at a Fangoria convention at one point, and I showed it to him, and he goes, "Oh, you still have that thing?" And I said, "Yeah, I think I'm supposed to get a discount." He goes, "No, I don't think you are." But
Go.
jumping ahead a little bit, can we talk a little bit about Re-Animator and how you got involved with Re-Animator?
Re-Animator. Never heard of the film. Oh,
Gee.
Re-Animator. Okay.
Right.
Sure. Actually, before we go into that, I have a correction for you guys. I listened
Yes.
to, as I mentioned in the beginning, I didn't listen to your whole podcast on TerrorVision, but I listened to a little bit of the one you had on prison, and
Yes.
you guys got something really wrong. So I just want to correct it here. It was kind of
Oh,
funny.
no.
Let's yeah,
Please,
it's okay.
yes.
Not a big thing, but you were making reference at one point uh, to how you were connecting some of the vibe or whatever to Alien, the music for Alien,
Yeah.
and that
Yeah.
you had heard or something that originally the movie was tracked with music from Alien. Um, so just now to set the record totally clear, it may have been tracked originally with Alien, but I was not the original composer on Prison. As
Okay.
it turns out, Rennie Harlan hired another composer because I was busy at the time on another project, and even though I was slated to do Prison, it didn't work out for a variety of reasons. And so I never heard or saw a version of the film with any track at all because when I got called in, it was about 3 weeks or so into the other composer who will remain nameless for obvious reasons. And the other composer was fired, and Rennie Harlan was decimated. And he came to me because he wanted this other guy to do it, and he knew I was slated to do it, so he felt somewhat embarrassed. And he came to me and he says, "I'm sorry, it just didn't work out with this guy. Can you find the time to do this and all this?" But at that time, not only had they run out of time, but they had run out of money for the score. So there was very little. There was very little money, and only about 2 weeks to do the whole score. So I was then given the print, and obviously went right to work because I only had 2 weeks to do the score. I never heard. There was never any temp track at all having to do with that. There may have been, maybe with the other composer. I have no idea.
Oh, let's talk about that a little bit then, because
Sure.
I think if we hadn't said it on the episode, we'll say it now. That score makes that film so much more substantial. First of all, um, it is not like a typical genre film, in my opinion. And Corey too. We love the score for Prison,
Yeah.
regardless of whether there. Yeah, obviously there wasn't a temp track, and I think Corey at one point you had said like you felt like an influence of some sort was on it, but the fact that you put that thing together in 2 weeks with no budget makes it even more special, in my opinion.
It was pretty crazy. It was, like I said, it was around 2 weeks that we did it in. But
Wow.
we had something that was very unique. At the time, there was this instrument, call it synthesizer, sampler, whatever, and it was a prototype. Nobody had it at that time. It was something called the wave frame. And
Okay.
my cohort on that film was Chris Stone, who I've worked on and off with for many, many years. And Chris is an electronics genius kind of guy, and a very, very good composer, by the way. So that's why Chris is co-credited on the film along with me. So
Okay.
so we went, so a big part of that film, as far as the music is concerned, is due to this particular instrument, because it was something that was so organic and sort of orchestral in nature, in the sounds and textures that we came up with. It was it had it was not an electronic-y sounding score at all, in my opinion. It was a very
No.
organic sounding
No.
score. And that's,
Yeah.
of course, that's always been my forte. I don't do, super electronic-y type scores. That's not. I'm more of an orchestral composer, so it had to be something that was conducive to the way, that that I write and so forth. And it was a lot of lucky timing to have that particular instrument available to us, and that's a big part of that the whole sound and feel of that score is due to that particular instrument.
That's really exciting because the 80s really, on so many levels, were bringing out new things or things that haven't really been done before. And the idea that you're basically experimenting with this, new technology, that's got to be, fun and scary at the same time.
Yeah, oh, definitely. But that is part of the fun of it all. I mean, you always want to be experimenting, whether it's with samplers, synthesizers, or a standard orchestra. I mean, as another example, but in a totally different way, when I recorded the score for Mutant, which I recorded in London, I had this crazy idea for a sound that could only be done with a large string section, and it had to do with this idea I had of the sound of thimbles going up and down the strings of the string section, violins, violas, and cello. And so I went out and bought like 60 thimbles to take to London for this experiment. And by the way, thimbles are not cheap, just so you know. So I end up spending like $500 on thimbles.
Oh my God.
And I take them to London. I'm doing this session, and I wanted this particular effect, which is in the score. And this is this weird sort of sliding effect, but that's experimenting, with real instruments. And all the string players,
That's
they
so
just
cool.
loved the idea. And I would say those bastards, they stole at least 80% of my thimbles. I only got maybe 20 of them back. They stole my thimbles. Oh well. The price of creativity, right? There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I hope
getting
you
back,
did, I hope you got through it.
no, that's a loss, but that's okay. It's all in the score.
From the depths of the earth, through the shrouded mist, it is coming, the final phase of an accident of nature.
Nothing human can have this in its veins and live.
It is unexplainable, unbelievable, and uncontrollable. You can't see it in the darkness or hear it in the silence, but you can feel its presence and sense the danger. Mutant.
Don't go out there.
Its time has come. Mutant. Any one of us could be one of them. There is no place left to run. Nowhere left to hide. And there is no escape.
We're gonna get out of here, you understand me? We're gonna get out.
Mankind's deadliest threat would not come from the skies. Mutant.
Whether it's being creative, with, like I said, samplers, synthesizers, new inventions, or inventing sounds, for real orchestras and all that. I mean, look at all you got to do for really interesting ways to make things sound with real orchestra. Look at, be it Bernard Herrmann or Jerry Goldsmith, what they could do with an orchestra for unique sounds was incredible. So,
Oh, totally.
So you have to. That's the whole point of trying to be creative with these things. That's the problem today. Is too much of all this stuff being put out sounds the same. It's ridiculous.
Exactly. Exactly. We Corey and I oftentimes will talk either on air or off air about the fact that a score can make or break a film, potentially, or elevate it. In the case of Prison, we just talked about the movie The Keep, which is has a lot of issues, a lot of problems.
Mm-hmm.
But the score itself by Tangerine Dream makes that movie so much better because of the score. Your movies, obviously have a very heavily orchestral influence, and like Re-Animator, going back to Re-Animator,
Mm-hmm.
I think you could hum the first bars of the opening to that film, and people automatically know the movie you're talking about just by humming the music to it.
That's true. I think there are two films that I've done that are like that, and that's one of them. And the other, without question, is Puppet Master. Those two films
of course.
are those two films definitely are. The music is intertwined with the movies themselves in a way that they just cannot ever be separated. That's true.
My first soundtracks that I ever bought as a kid were Full Moon soundtracks, and it's because
Really?
I'd watch it at the end of the video zone on Puppet Master.
Yeah.
And I'd watch. I always love that. That was one of the things I always look forward to the Full Moon films was the featurette before featurettes were even a thing. First of all,
Right. Right.
it's very
Right.
groundbreaking. And there would always be this, the plug for you'd have to mail away for the catalog, and
Right.
and I would get the catalog and mail in the CDs. The first CDs that I ever owned that I purchased myself were Full Moon CDs. I think it was like Puppet Master and possibly Dr. Mordred also.
Oh yeah.
Those two
Oh,
were
definitely.
like, and so your music has been, like I said earlier in the show, has been a part of our lives for a very long time, and Re-Animator obviously is one of the most memorable across the board. But you've done so many Full Moon films, and you pretty much started working with your brother from the get-go, right?
Yeah. Well, we started. Yeah. Well, the very first film was Laser Blast, and
Yeah.
and even though it was the politics of things, how you get certain things is really weird. I mean, back then that was the first film that I did, but it was still under the guise of Compass International, which was run by Irwin Yablans. Irwin Yablans and Compass were the people who put out the original Halloween. He made his fortune and created his distribution company through that. So a lot of the films in the very beginning were under the Compass International umbrella or flag, and so there was always, on my part, a lot of convincing to do to get those jobs because they were controlled by Irwin Yablans and not necessarily my brother or anything. Plus, in the very beginning, like anybody else, you got to prove yourself. You got to prove that what you can do. So yeah, I mean, over the years, my family, and this includes when my father was still alive. Of course, he's been gone for 18 years now, but we always worked together a lot as a family, and everybody did, their part, and everybody followed their own dreams. Starting with my father as a producer, director, and writer, and then my brother as a distributor and producer and director on some films, and me, I was more the black sheep of the family with the music, kept on my own, but I wanted to do my thing, and sort of that's where it was. And yeah, and sure, we work to this day. We still work together, but a lot of people. Well, I don't know whether it's true or not, whether what they believe, but a lot of people assume, that I do all my brother's films, which is very far from the truth. Yeah, I do, maybe a couple a year, or maybe 2 or 3 a year at the very, very most, because most of my work is done with other companies, with whether it's Paramount, or for years with Warner Brothers and other independent films. There's a ton of work out there that has nothing to do with Full Moon or back in the Empire days or what have you. But there's also no question that the 80s, which in which there was a large bulk of my work was done, with orchestra and all that. That a good portion of it, was with Empire and or the beginning with Full Moon. But that was my brother and I. So it's a mixed bag of things, and what are you going to do? That's life, right?
well, being it worked out for your family that you did music because they they needed someone to score their movies, and obviously you were it for not all of them, but just for a lot of the more memorable Full Moon movies, I would say. And you have a relationship with Brian Usna, right? Because you obviously did the 3
Right.
Re-Animator films.
Right. Well, with Brian, of course, and as or more importantly, with Stuart Gordon. I mean, I did most of Stuart Gordon's films, and and when he went into some of the television stuff, I did the most of the Masters of Horror series. I did 3 of those, of which the first one for Stewart, Dreams in the Witch House, that actually got me an Emmy nomination, which was very unusual for a horror score to get an Emmy nomination.
Yeah, absolutely.
And with Brian, I had done not only those films that where Stewart was connected, but several others as well. And it's another person I've done a bunch of stuff with, albeit more recently. From starting back with Masters of Horror was, of course, Mick Garris, who's a good friend and a fantastic guy. And in fact, was it last year or this year? I did Nightmare Cinema for him, which came out, I think it was late last year. I'm trying to remember, but that was like an anthology film, sort of along the lines of what he did with Masters of Horror. He brought in 5 top directors, and they each had their episode, kind of like the Twilight Zone movie type of thing. And I did Mix, and I had the great opportunity to work on another one of those 5, also with Joe Dante. I did his, and I did all the titles and interstitial stuff. So that was a nice job. I don't know if you guys have seen it, but I think it's pretty good.
Well, I was going to say too, you're working with phenomenal people. Stuart Gordon is a national treasure, I think. It just his resume speaks for itself. But how did you get involved with Re-Animator? How did that all come about?
Jeez, it's so long ago, I don't really remember, but I do remember that Brian and Stuart, they had brought the property originally to my father, and subsequently to my father and brother, and they were very intent on making this film, but they were very insistent on, Stuart obviously directing and Brian being the producer and so forth. So the deal that they made was much more of a distribution deal with Empire at the time. And somehow in that period of time, Stuart had heard a couple of my scores. I think one was for The Alchemist that I did years before that, and Mutant, and so he liked a lot of my stuff that I had done back then. And so somehow we met for a dinner or something. I don't remember exactly, but I remember that after the dinner we went back to his place, and just to keep yakking and all this, and we both discovered that we were both major Frank Zappa fans, and we spent the the next 2 hours singing Frank Zappa songs. And
did Dynamo Hum come up in that? Did Dynamo Hum come up in that?
No, that one didn't, but all the stuff from Freak Out did, and all of that. So we knew that we hit it off big time. Let's just put it that way, as far as our musical taste, our sense of humor, and all that. And so it was from that point on. That was kind of it. That's kind of what solidified the whole thing, the whole relationship. It dates back to that.
I think what's so cool about that is that it has nothing to do with the type of music that you put out, but what brings people together, the connections that they share, whether it be a movie or a quirky film, or a particular musician who is kind of is not mainstream but definitely respected. Frank Zappa is unbelievably talented, and
oh my God, okay,
has a whole, it's ridiculous. Actually, my stepfather was the one who introduced me to Frank Zappa, and we used to listen to his albums all the time when we'd work, when we do contracting work. And so people walk up and they're like, "What are you guys listening to?" I'm like, "Oh, Frank Zappa." But I was gonna say, hey, that'll get you a good conversation starter. Your Re-Animator is, obviously is a big one, but I was going to tell you too that The Resurrected is a very much a personal favorite, and a very underrated film in my opinion.
I agree.
From the author of Terror, H.P. Lovecraft. From the director of Return of the Living Dead.
There's no evil in what I do, so long as I do it rightly.
The Resurrected.
I have struck depths that your little brain cannot fathom.
He lived centuries ago.
It is to be expected. The dead take much blood.
But for him, death was only the beginning.
The cops found 8 boxes of human remains. Turns out they've had a rash of tomb snatchings over in Europe.
Now, this wizard from the past.
Don't you understand what's going on down here, Lonnie? He beat death.
Has teamed with a man from the present.
He's talking about bringing people back from the dead.
To create an evil that will last forever.
As the hunger grows, my control will surely weaken.
The best we can hope for is to somehow diminish Charles's homicidal and cannibalistic impulses. The curse of the formerly dead is the hunger, and it will not be denied.
Chris Sarandon of Fright Night and Child's Play.
I have drawn down demons from the stars. There'll be no salvation for thee.
John Terry of In Country and Full Metal Jacket. Jane Sibbett of television's The Famous Teddy Z.
The destinies of all things, living and dead, are mine.
The Resurrected.
That score, the score, the look, everything is very, it's very beautiful. So when you go into scoring these films, like, can you talk a bit about that as far as, let's take The Resurrected, for example. Like when you look at that movie and what influences you on where you're going with the music for the film?
Well, a few things. First of all, when I look at a movie to begin with, it has to speak to me somehow, and that's one of the reasons I hate temp scores like they do today, is because it obviously influences the way you see a film for the first time. Now I understand why people do temp scores. There's a variety of reasons today, but in the old days, i.e., when I started out, and nobody had a friggin' temp score. They were hiring you to be creative and and come up with stuff, not say, here, we want it to sound like John Williams. So it was a different time, and so when I look at a film, I'm trying to first see, what's the film about? What is it saying to me, and what's it trying to say to me? And then lastly, how is music going to help out this, not necessarily this this particular scene, but why does the music have to be in there? And usually on a film, for me, it comes down to the characters that are written in the script and their relationships with the main subject matter. So in the case of Resurrected, there was a plethora of stuff to work with, because one, it was kind of like a current day investigator type of thing. So it had an element of suspense, but more importantly, the subject matter itself had to do, with going back into the not too distant past, i.e. the last 150 years, and witchcraft and legend and those dungeons and science. And so it introduced so many good levels and ingredients to deal with, and resurrection, and all of these sorts of things. So not only did you have the the topical today type characters, but they were having to go back into an incredibly rich past of of intrigue and the whole period, and that we were just talking about. So it had to have a not only the music had, it was, what it was saying to me is, not only did it have to have some of those elements of the modern day part, but more importantly, it had to show through the history of what goes on in the film, as more and more that we discover, I kept viewing it as going down deeper into the depths of those catacombs, discovering more and more about the science and the experiments that were going on hundreds of years ago, and how it was all tied into, be it the witchcraft as they might have seen it then, but it was actually science and the whole Lovecraftian aspect of it. So it was a combination of things that were important to bring out in the film. So getting back to your original question, I try to look at what is driving the elements that are driving a film that are not the obvious ones. The obvious ones is you see what you see on the screen and you hear the dialogue, but what's driving all that? What's underneath it that you're not seeing or hearing? And that's always the approach I try to take when scoring a film. You don't have to be hit over the head with what's going on the screen or with the dialogue, but what I think makes good scoring is to go underneath all of that and bring out the feelings and the tension that's driving everything. Does that kind of explain your question?
Oh yeah, totally. I think it more than I expected, because I just think it's so cool that there's so many factors that influence the score itself. It's really phenomenal.
Well, I think to do good scoring, you got to look into those things. It's very easy just to, say, okay, the guy's up there and he's chasing a car, so let's put a drum in there and go chaka 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 for the chase. I mean, what's big about that? That's pretty easy, but it doesn't say anything. All you're doing is just putting some music behind what you're seeing on the screen. So that's like, it doesn't mean anything. Ideally, the score that you're doing, if you really want to score something creatively and properly, you have to look deeper. I have a saying I've been saying for years, is that I think that music and film is really the third dimension of a two-dimensional medium. That's what I think it is. It's not. And forget 3D movies for a second. I'm not talking about that. It's just but it is a third dimension. A film itself is a two-dimensional medium, and music is that third dimension, that unseen thing that you feel, that propagates and influences, and that's a different dimension. That's what I think scoring is.
I mean, I couldn't agree more with that. Growing up, like I said, as more of a visual artist, I always loved movies. Obviously, because Zach and I do this podcast, but it's not until kind of in my adult life, and especially thanks to friends like Zach, who have more of a musical background, that I'm actually able to develop a music language that I didn't have before, and I'm able to actually go back and further enjoy these movies that, like, I used to love, but now I can love on a whole new level because I can appreciate the score that goes into them. Something that I just as a silly kid who just kind of just looked at things on the visual surface level, I kind of missed. But growing up now, and I love it. This is amazing, and I completely agree with what you're saying. It's, even if you don't realize that it's adding a layer to the movie, it is still doing that. And just being able to analyze it and look at it, you can appreciate films on a whole new level. And I truly wish I had more of a background of listening to soundtracks and whatnot growing up as a kid. I wish I had that. So, but
well,
this is
you know
awesome.
what? It doesn't really matter, because your initial influence got you to this point. And this point will get you to the next point. It's all
Yeah.
it's all
Totally.
progression, you know.
Yeah.
So
Totally.
you're good. You're good. Don't worry about
and,
it.
and this is, I mean, and you know, unbeknownst to you, this is kind of like my Ringo Starr moment with you. I mean, because you're
Oh,
cool
come
as
on
hell
now.
too. So
Come
this
on.
is fantastic. So
No, look, and I will concur with Corey because you know, here's the thing. It doesn't matter whether someone is on a global scale known like a Ringo Starr or whether they're known to genre fans. You, like I've said before, and I'll say it again, you have had a very positive influence on our lives. This is really a treat to have you on the show.
I do very much appreciate and respect my fan base. I've been lucky enough to do you know, maybe a couple of conventions, 2 or 3 a year, where I go and meet the fans around the country and all that. And yeah, I think it's really important because uh, you know, people really people really like this stuff, and they respect it. And I don't a lot of the attitudes I see of people who sort of poo-poo these things. I really don't like that.
Yeah.
I think that you know, that the fan base is incredibly important, not just for me, but for films themselves, for the genre itself. And you know, it's important to get out there and try to be magnanimous and have, you know, let people know that you're human like anybody else. You know, it's pretty simple.
Well,
In other words,
thank
very
you for saying
simply,
that.
don't the whole thing in life, just don't be an asshole. You know, you don't have to be no need to be an asshole.
there's already too many of those in the world. And,
Too many
and Zach and
assholes.
yeah,
Exactly.
there's way too many. And
Right.
that's the one thing we like that we try to do with this podcast is you know, like people look, it's so easy to look at some of these movies now under like a 2020 lens and be like, oh, that was silly or whatever. But we try to bring the love. We try to just talk about it and nothing but love, because there's so many, you can do so many snarky comments and stuff, but why don't you find the love in it, you know, and embrace what you love and enjoy what you embrace and everything. And boy, we just, you know, we love these movies. We love these cult classic films.
Right. No, I agree. It's very easy to poo-poo 90% of these films. I mean, they you know, it's very easy to do. I mean, I've always sort of lamented the fact, and I've been told this so many times. You know, people say, "Boy, why do you do such great music for such terrible films?" and I go,
Gosh.
I go, it's simple. I said, I fall in love with each one of them. You know, you got to be creative, and this is actually a truth in life. To be creative, you have to fall in love with what you're doing. You can't be creative and hate what you're doing.
Yeah.
No.
So I've got to. So even if it's a turd, I'm going to make that the best, most intelligent, greatest turd in the world. You know. So what?
Yeah.
It's still going to have. It'll still have good music at the end, even if it is a turd. But you know what?
Right.
So what?
Well,
You know, you gotta love it. You gotta love it.
Yeah, nothing
was,
good creative
I had
ever
the-
comes out of negativity or hatred. You know, nothing good creative comes out of
Nope.
that.
That is the bottom line to it all. It really is. So, you know, love what you're doing. It's like the song, love the one you're with, I guess. I don't know.
Why not? Sure. That's the one you're with. If the one you're with is creativity, then that's a pretty damn good one to be with. So
There you go.
Your muse.
There you go.
You know, I was just really quick on the Resurrected. I had interviewed Bob Romanis a while back, and Bob Romanis is known to most people as Damone from Fast Times at Ridgemont High, but he had a pretty good supporting role in the Resurrected, and he talked about the fondness he had for that movie. And I think, like you said, going into the backstory as to why, how you came up with the music for it, and knowing that, and hopefully people will revisit that film, because it's got a lot more going on than it was seen at the time. It was kind of buried in the video section at the rental stores, and Definitely worth revisiting.
It was.
For sure.
No, it was. And just so you guys know, I am going to actually be revisiting it, and I'm doing a whole remix of the entire score in the next 6 months. So it's going to be re-released with a whole new mix. I actually found the original masters to the whole thing, and as I've done with a couple of other scores, like my score for Ghost Warrior recently that was reissued, where I found all the masters and the new recording. It's just, I mean, it sounds incredible. It's so much better, something that was done so many years ago, but just it sounds like it was done yesterday. It was just sounds beautiful. So I am going to be doing the same thing with the Resurrected, as well as another issue with the same idea for From Beyond, another score that I did with Stuart Gordon, as you know. So I managed to find those masters. So in the next 6 months to a year, those will be coming out as well, totally remastered and redone.
Oh, that's exciting. I mean, From Beyond is also a personal favorite of Corey and I. Exclusive news. Wow.
That's awesome.
There you go. Yeah, you guys got an exclusive there.
That's great.
Well, I was gonna say too, on Podcasting After Dark, you are our first music composer, and
Cool.
and you may not know this, but I told Peter this via email. I've been trying to get you on the show for the better part of the year. When we first started, Corey and I talked about getting guests on our show. I said, I really want to get Richard Band on the show just to talk about who he is and get his background and all that. So,
well, cool.
Again, I think your ego's been inflated quite a bit, but
I think so. No, that's you guys are much too kind. Much too kind.
Well, to
So
tack
other
on
than
to
the-
that,
the
I'll just
two
have
re-
to say that the fans are blowing up. They cannot wait for this interview. So you have a ton of fans through us and outside of us and everything. It's awesome.
Well, that's great. That's great. Well,
Mr. Richard Band, I just to wrap up, I just want to say it's been a pleasure having you on our show. Corey and I have been talking about as when COVID lifts and things start to get back to normal, taking our show, because it's gained so much popularity, taking our show to a live audience and doing a show perhaps in LA in the near future. Maybe we do a screening of one of the movies you've scored and we have you on as a guest. That would be an honor to have you there.
well, that would be a great thing to do, and I think it's so vitally important for everybody listening to have those sorts of things happen sooner rather than later. Wear a fucking mask, would you?
Yeah.
Don't be squids.
Yes.
Wear a mask.
Don't be an a-hole. Don't be an asshole.
That's right.
Wear a mask.
Exactly. Very simple message. There you go.
Yep. That's the theme of this episode.
I think-
Don't be an
There
asshole.
you go. Exactly.
Don't be an asshole. I think that's the button on this one. Richard, thank you so much
My
again.
pleasure.
And we look forward to seeing you in person in the near future.
Absolutely. We will.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, guys.
This has been a huge honor.
Be well. Thank you so much. Be well.
You too.
Stay safe. Bye-bye.
You too.
Thanks.
Take care. Thank you for listening to Podcasting After Dark's exclusive interview series with Richard Band. And, as always, thank you for your support.
Imagine being one of the last people on Earth, being trapped alone with something not human, something always watching, something always waiting. What would you do? Where would you run? Where would you hide? if you were haunted for 7 winters alone.
Podcasting After Dark presents 7 Winters Alone, a dystopian haunted house story by David Irons.
Available now in paperback and ebook.